Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Jameen. I am the founder of Visionary Accounting Group, where we serve nonprofit organizations, providing them with outsourced accounting services. If you are an oldie but goodie, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about audit prep, but we're specifically going to be talking about it from the perspective of executive directors. So I'm going to be walking you through sort of a step-by-step guide for executive directors and how to prepare for an audit. So for many of you, when you are watching this, you're probably either preparing for or will be preparing for an upcoming audit, as we have just ended 2024. And so I wanted to give you guys a video that would be timely as you kind of are gearing up for audit season. So if that sounds like you, then stick around. Let's level set first. Audits are not just about compliance. They're also about trust, honestly. And you might be thinking, trust, right? Well, whether it's grant funders, if it's, individual donors, if it's board members, right? The public wants to know that the organization is managing its finances with integrity, right? So you're almost like being rated on your ability to steward the money that has been given to your organization to serve its mission. A clean audit helps to build credibility, right? It shines a light that you are doing things well, and it can also open doors to other, sometimes larger, funding opportunities. When we think about having a clean audit, one of the major keys to that is preparation. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first step is to get organized, right? You want to organize your financial records. Speaking specifically to executive directors, a lot of you, at least for those who are watching this, you still have a hand in your organization's finances. And that's why some of this is going to, it won't be jargony, but it is going to be a bit specific than typically we'd have to discuss if you had like a bookkeeper or someone who is managing your organization's finances. Because if you do, then they would really be doing this first set of items as it relates to organizing, because it's specific to like the bookkeeping. So things like your general ledger, right? We know typically before auditors even get into the nitty-gritty, they will always request your trial balance and your general ledger, right? At the very, very beginning. And so you want to make sure that those items are up to date, they're complete. You want to make sure they're reconciled, right? And so these are just like very basic level we're talking to start off, right? And the next is you want to make sure bank statements, you have them. You want to make sure that you have access to them, you have them saved somewhere, and that they agree back to the general ledger. Auditors will look at not just the year that's being audited. They typically will look at the first 1 to 2 months past the audit period as well. So you want to make sure that you have all of that prepared. The third thing you want to have organized are grant agreements and contracts, right? You want to keep these handy because it helps to verify if any of the funding is restricted. It helps to also specifically state like what the restrictions are, what the stipulations are around the grants, and also depending on the type of funding, right? If it's federal, if you've hit the threshold, you might have to have a single audit. So you just want to have these things prepared. And then the other piece, lastly, is like expense documentation. So depending on the size of the organization determines the materiality threshold. And so that is something that the auditor calculates. You won't know that. But as a rule of thumb, your organization should have a threshold that it uses to determine at what stage or point or amount rather are you requiring receipts, right? So it might be, if it's $25 and below, you're okay if a receipt goes missing, not uploaded. But for anything above $25, there absolutely must be a receipt. And so you want to make sure that whatever that rule of thumb is, right, you want to make sure that it's being followed. But then you also want to make sure that these receipts are being filed away and are easily accessible, so that when a sample selection is done, you can easily access the backup. Step 2 is you want to review your internal controls. Now, auditors typically want to see that you have processes in place to prevent fraud. Now we know, you watch the news, you see things, and it is because things are very heavily regulated in the nonprofit space, you want to just make sure that you have all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed. So here are some questions that you can begin to ask yourself to determine whether or not you have some internal controls in place or whether there might be some gaps. So the first one is like, do you have clear processes for approval? And this is specific to like expenses, to bills, right? Are there levels of approval? Where does that happen? Is there anything that is saved that shows that something has been approved? So A good example would be bill pay, right? So most of our clients use bill.com. Vendors will email bills directly to the bill.com email. One person reviews the bills, imports them into, adds them rather to the system, make sure they're categorized, all that good stuff. But then that bill is sent to a specific person to approve. And it's not until approval is made that the bill is then paid. But all of this is logged. The trail is in bill.com. I'm not so new to this that I haven't done this manually. I've been in organizations that had a more manual process, and it included like stamps on the bills and then the bill being filed away before payment being made. Whatever your process, you need to have a process. It needs to be documented. And if the auditor was to select a bill, an expense, they need to be able to clearly see the trail of events. And so you want to think about that. The next question is, are there segregation of duties, right? And that could mean a couple of different things. So depending on the process, is there any one person handling A to Z? Because typically that's where the environment for fraud can be created, when there are no checks and balances, when someone, doesn't have someone who is reviewing over their work, right? And so, an example could be made that the person who is receiving, checks shouldn't also be the person that is depositing said checks, right? Or if you're receiving and depositing, is someone else reviewing, right? Is there a check log? Who's reviewing, who's reconciling and then reviewing the reconciliations? And so you want to think in those terms. And then lastly, are your financial policies documented and are they up to date? I have seen wild things, but you want to make sure that you have a fiscal manual. So we're not talking about policies and procedures specific to the organization. Now we're specifically talking about a fiscal manual for how you do things in fiscal, right? How are you managing the organization's finances? There has to be a separate manual for that. That will include things like how you manage cash receipts, payments, cash disbursements, how you're reconciling, how are you handling payroll, confidential documents around, compensation and things like that. What are your month-end procedures? Those types of things. You have to have a manual that is specific, right, to those financial items. If any of these areas are weak, right, you want to start taking action now, right? And again, you can't do everything at once. But think about rate. What are the pain points that you're experiencing that are a direct result of missing some of these things? What are some of the gaps that you've identified that is going to affect your ability to get a clean audit, right? And then rate them in priority and start to tackle them that way. And hopefully you're not doing this alone and you can delegate, because the next section, or step rather, is going to be to prepare your team, right? And so if any of those areas, those internal control areas are weak, you want to take action now. Strengthening the internal controls, it not only helps you during an audit, but it just also protects the organization. There are too many people out here that, prey on the fact that nonprofits are run by people who truly love the mission and the work that the organization is doing. And unfortunately, things like scandals and fraud happen. And so by having internal controls in place, you can protect the organization. So now we're talking about preparing your team, right? So audit prep truly is not a solo mission. And for those of you who have probably went through it solo, you're probably shaking your head like, it absolutely is not, right? It is a team effort. And so you want to make sure that first, everyone understands their role, and then you want to make sure that there are set times that you guys are meeting and making sure that things are going along well. And so some things to think about. So for us, the clients that we work with, when they're audited, we lead the audit process. And so we meet with the auditors, all right, we're sending and providing consistent updates to the client so that they know where the audit is, where the audit stands. But then also we are responsible for providing the documentation. And so we kind of serve as the middleman. If there is something we don't know, don't have access to, whatever that is, then we will go back to the client. And this sort of helps to kind of, yes, streamline, but it also takes some pressure off of the executive director who is just managing a ton of things. You want to think about, is there anyone that can help you? If you don't have someone who is helping you with the finances, it can be an admin. It can be your operations person. Some of the support could look like all they do, because if they don't have an accounting background, you might be thinking they can't help me. That's not necessarily true. If they're an admin, they can do things like first creating you an audit folder, right? And then saving down your statements, making sure that all of the documentation that has been sent to the auditors is organized, there are other things beyond just having accounting knowledge that can actually help to support you. And so you want to make sure that everyone understands their role. You want to make sure that if you do have a bookkeeper, that you're working with that person to ensure that, you know, accurate records are being kept and that you're looping them in on timeline. And typically you want to have some sort of like pre-audit meeting with all of those involved to give them updates, to kind of outline how this is going to go, who's responsible for what, so that it's not a surprise when you receive that initial audit kickoff email, right? Because I know that can be like, ooh, now we're getting started. Now you want to conduct this pre-audit meeting, right? Some call it like a pre-audit review, initial audit meeting, whatever you want to call it. But the idea is to maybe use a checklist. We have a checklist, right, that we use, and we go through it to ensure that everything that can be in order is in order. Because granted, we don't know what the sample selection is going to be. There are just some things that you can't prepare for, but the things that you can, you want to make sure that you're doing that, right? So things that you might want to double check is like looking over your financial statements, making sure that you understand what they're saying, where these numbers come from. If there's anything that's abnormal that you're not sure about, get clarity, because if you're not sure about it, it's very well possible that someone else is going to ask a question. You need to be able to answer, right? You want to think about what are your grant reporting obligations, right? Because that's a question that typically is going to come from the auditors as well. You want to have that kind of information handy. And so you want to make sure that you understand what's required of you from these grants that they're going to be looking at. And then backup documentation. So you don't know what the sample selection is going to be. However, you do know they're going to select one. So, you know, are all your receipts in order? Are expenses organized? If you've had any significant event that's happened throughout the year, chances are they're going to ask about it. So if there's anything like that, be prepared, pull that documentation. If this is not your first audit, you can even be more prepared, because the PBC, that provided by client list, typically doesn't change year over year. You can actually start preparing those schedules, doing as much as you can ahead of time so that it doesn't feel chaotic when things actually kick off. To build a relationship with your auditor. Unfortunately, I am finding that post-pandemic, it is really difficult to lock in nonprofit auditors. So if you have someone that you're using and you like them, please hold on to them, right? I think a lot of times auditors get a bad rep. They're like looked at as like the bad guys, but they're going to be your partners in accountability. Remember that, right? So you want to be proactive about communication. You want to be open and sharing and collaborative, because one, it makes it go quicker, and also it helps not to raise any red flags as to maybe why you're being difficult, why you're not sharing. The connotations just aren't good, right? And so you want to think about that. Again, if this is an auditor that you've used before, you know what they've asked for in the back. So maybe come to the table with these things already prepared, already gathered, right? The smoother the process, the quicker it's going to go. The last, which is a bonus, and it's not really a prep tip, it's like a post tip, is to make sure that after the audit is done, you don't just save down the audit report and move on. You got to make sure that you take heed to those recommendations and those suggestions, because they also help in the future. One, to just operate better as an organization, but also to make sure that you have smoother audits in the future. So these are my prep tips for executive directors. If there's anything that you want to know more about, or that you want me to dive deeper into, whether it's certain schedules, how to prepare those things, how to get the data out of QBO, then drop them in the comments. I am coming up with video topics for this year. So if there's certain things that you want to learn about, please share and let me know. And then lastly, I'm going to plug, because why not, the Accounting for Good community. We launched our community last year. It is for nonprofit executive directors, leaders, those of you who truly want to learn how to lead your organization better from a financial capacity. So we're talking all things financial, fiscal management. And so if that is a goal for you this year, if you are in charge of the finances at your organization, you want to make sure that you are doing what you need to do to learn how to run your organization well. And so the link to the community to learn more about it will be in the description box. But that's all for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one.